Eventually, though, in the churches of Christ, there were a couple of concerns that developed. One was, for a lot of Protestant denominations in the late 19th, early 20th century, Sunday schools were often operated as something outside of the congregation. It was kind of a distinct unit from the congregation, from the worship and work of the church. And so here are these members of churches of Christ who have been opposed to things like the missionary society because it is something outside the congregation. And so when these Sunday schools are started and they're looking at, these other denominations and saying, okay, this seems to be something outside the church. So there's that concern. Secondly, the children were often taught by women. And so there's a little concern about, well, what role do women have in the church? And then also, once you have a male who has been baptized, can a woman still teach that male and be in compliance with the teachings in 1 Timothy chapter 2 about women not teaching men? So there's the question of, is this supposed to be something that's part of the congregation? Is it separate from the congregation? The role of women also becomes an issue. But the greater issues were, for some people, there was no scriptural authorization for a church to have a Sunday school. Now remember, churches of Christ are tending towards the view of scriptural silence that says, if there's not authorization for it, if there's not a positive command that says, do this, then you shouldn't do it. Well, there's no positive command about Sunday schools. Furthermore, they would argue that the education of children was left to the parents, not to the church. So there's a growing group within churches of Christ that are concerned about the presence of Sunday schools. And so you have developing a non-Sunday school wing within churches of Christ that did not use the Sunday school program. A lot of churches and churches of Christ are developing it and using it. Eventually, journals like the Gospel Advocate, some other popular journals among churches of Christ are producing literature for Sunday schools, from the youngest kids the whole way up to adults. Other times, there's other literature that kind of borrows from denominational Sunday school literature, but would be slightly modified. Other publishing houses develop as well. So these non-Sunday school churches develop minority group largely in places like Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas. My wife is from Oklahoma, and she is from a tiny little town of like 1,200 people in Oklahoma. There are two churches of Christ in that tiny town because there was a split between the group. Both of them are non-Sunday school churches. So there are. It seems like that region right in there, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, that's where a majority of those churches are that are non-Sunday school churches. You'll find a few scattered in other places, but most churches of Christ use the Sunday school type of program. Usually, of course, within the context of it's another ministry within the church.
So her particular church in Oklahoma does have Sunday school.
Well, they actually went to a nearby town because it did have a Sunday school. But there's two congregations that right there in that tiny little town of 1,200 people. And there's two. Yeah, there was a church split and all sorts of things, but yeah, but Oklahoma, of course, is one of those places. What you also see kind of developing closely connected, that kind of also splits among the churches of Christ that's kind of connected to this issue is what are known as the one-cup churches of Christ. So while the one-cup churches are largely, their issue has to do with communion, not so much Sunday schools. But a lot of the one-cup churches tend to be non-Sunday school churches. So the division that happens is within the non-Sunday school churches where some are one cup, some are multiple cups. The question is it allowable to use more than one cup in communion? Or should it be just one cup? Now, to us today, if we're not part of that wing, it might not seem like that big of a deal to have multiple cups. But this comes again out of that mindset of the positive command. So Jesus talks about in Matthew 26, for example, in Matthew 26:27, when Jesus is instituting the Lord's Supper, he takes the cup, singular. And so these one-cup churches believe that there was only to be one cup. When you look at Mark and Luke, Jesus says, divide it among yourself, right? So it wasn't the idea that they were all drinking from the same cup. So, but essentially the idea becomes, for these churches, don't have Sunday schools and only use one cup in communion. And that split takes place in the 1930s. There were other things that continued to develop around this issue of institutionalism. There had been a variety of educational institutions developing within the Restoration movement since the beginning of it. And we've talked about some of those schools, preacher training groups, colleges that had all began in the 19th century. But in the 20th century, there was an even greater concern. So a sizable group of colleges developed within the Restoration movement after the Civil War and into the 20th century. Most of those new colleges that developed tended to be in the more Churches of Christ wing of the Restoration movement, because a lot of the colleges in the 19th century tended to go with the disciples when the split took place. And so Churches of Christ had to start their own colleges. Also,
all the Churches of Christ started their own colleges.
Yes, when the split happened, most of the colleges that were in existence went with the disciples. And so the Churches of Christ started their own colleges to have education.
Like Faulkner.
Well, eventually, yeah, Faulkner, that's more this kind of 1940s, World War II kind of, but the early 20th century. So, like the National Bible School, which becomes David Lipscomb, Lipscomb College, and then Lipscomb University would be an example of this. Harding University starts. They're kind of that late 19th, early 20th century.
So Lipscomb is Church of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What you also see in this post-Civil War period is the development of a variety of state universities. There hadn't been too many before this of these universities supported by states, provided state funding, what are often known as the Landgrant Universities. Some of your usually universities that have the name of the state in them. A lot of those tend to be these land-grant universities that start after the Civil War. So there's this general educational development post-Civil War into the 20th century. A lot of the colleges associated with the Churches of Christ start off as, in the late 19th, early 20th century, they start off as schools that are preparing people, predominantly men, for ministry, and particularly preaching. There's not really too many other ministry focuses at this time. So the focus is predominantly preparing people to preach. Within the disciples in the 20th century, of course, there are already those institutions like Bethany College, for example, a couple other colleges as well, that are maintained. But here you have the Churches of Christ doing this huge institution building of colleges. The disciples kind of decrease that to focus on the ones they already have. So instead of making a lot of new ones, they're focused on, kind of really focusing on the ones that are already established. So you have this boom in building of colleges that takes place, and this is part of institutionalizing. Another aspect of institutionalizing that takes place in this 19th, 20th century bridge here, what's known as the Bible chair movement. Now, beginning in the late 19th century, especially in these land-grant universities, religion was not taught in public education. And so throughout the 19th into the 20th century, as these new universities are started, religion is not to be a part of that because they are supported by the state. And so the separation of church and state and federal funding gets involved, those kind of things. So, with those developments and with a lot of students turning to state education as opposed to Christian colleges in the early 20th century, there was an effort to try and find some way to provide some sort of religious education to those individuals who were getting their degrees at a state institution as opposed to a Christian college. So the Restoration movement on both sides, both the disciples and the Churches of Christ, start developing what become known as the Bible chairs. These were positions that were funded by people within the movement, usually a particular congregation close to a big college. And usually it just started out as an academic lecture series where the local congregation would bring in somebody who had advanced education in Bible and would invite students to come and hear this lecture. Eventually, though, it's provided religious education at these state institutions without state funding. So it was a way for students at state colleges or universities to have some religious education, but the state wasn't paying for it, the state wasn't necessarily supporting it, and the state wasn't requiring it. Also, a lot of these were under the control of the local church. The first one of these Bible chairs appears to have been the University of Michigan in 1893. There was one at the University of Virginia by 1899, and then they continued to pop up in a variety of places, University of Texas and other places. Eventually, some of these universities would offer credit, usually a minimal credit, for courses taken under the Bible chairs. So you could take a course and maybe get 2 credits or 3 credits towards your degree. Not a lot. You couldn't major in religion at the let's say, the University of Michigan, but you could take a couple courses, a course or 2, and get a couple credits towards your bachelor's degree. We're not talking campus ministry. Campus ministry is not really something that develops until like the late 20th century, post-World War II. Now, certainly there's probably some ministerial, pastoral, counseling types of things that took place with students, and because a lot of those Bible chairs would have been ministers as well as having advanced degrees. But the main focus is the academics. Eventually, some of these would move into becoming a religion type of department. At Virginia, the university made the Bible chair a department in 1909. There's still kind of, that very position, that difficult position of, well, it's kind of part of the university, but it's not because the state doesn't fund it. Today, of course, you can study religion at the University of Virginia, and a lot of other state universities, from a non-sectarian, non-professing type of position. A ruling was made in the Supreme Court in the 1960s that religion could be taught as long as it wasn't necessarily promoted. Right? And so you're not established, so you can teach world religions, you can study religion as a human phenomenon, those kind of things. But in the early 20th century, that wasn't something that you did. If you wanted to study religion, you went to a seminary or you went to a Christian college.